some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. The rich man can never be what he ought to be until the poor man is what he ought to be.
A year and a half before the Greensboro, North Carolina sit-ins, a group of children in Oklahoma City walked into Katz Drug Store, sat down at the lunch counter, and asked for service.
The civil rights bound field has been fought here in Oklahoma, and we have taken more cases to the Supreme Court than any other state in the history of America.
I said, Miss Luper, you have my consent with one exception, and that is I don't want any adults involved in doing the actual sitting, because adults, contrary to what they may think, are more prone to violence and action than these kids would be.
The children were asked to leave, but they continued to show up week after week for 6 years.
I think people were kind of shocked. The waitresses, they were wondering, who's this little group of black kids?
Is that we had not yet developed a lower self-esteem. Understanding that self-esteem, or high self-esteem, is a prerequisite for being prosperous.
What it felt like to walk into a restaurant and not be served. You didn't have many opportunities to do that because you understood the law and you were not to do that.
No one knew that a group of Oklahoma City kids were heroes, not even the kids themselves. It all began August 19th, 1958, with 13 children walking into Katz Drug Store asking for service. By the end, hundreds of our young participated. 50 years later, journalist George Tomick speaks with some of the original sit-in children. This is their story.
How did you become involved? How did you get into the sit-in movement?
Miss Luper. I think
Miss Luper.
Clara Luper was that.
Yes.
In 1956, Clara Luper attended the National NAACP conference, where she listened to a guest speaker, a 27-year-old minister from Montgomery, Alabama, whose name was Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. King had just caught the national spotlight as leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. Clara left that conference inspired. A year later, Clara became the youth advisor for the Oklahoma City NAACP Youth Council.
And Miss Luper was very, very concrete and very specific in how she taught history. In Ms. Luper's class, you couldn't move forward if you didn't know the Constitution, if you didn't understand how the government worked. You had to be able to recite the Declaration of Independence. You had to be able to recite Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And I'm not talking about when you got to high school. I'm talking about elementary, middle school. And once you understand that, nobody needs to recruit you to join in and participate. The challenge then becomes convincing your parents that it's okay.
You knew something was wrong because everybody else could be served, but you could not be served for one reason and one reason only, and that was because of the color of your skin. And not one of us had anything to do with the color of our skin.
We were taught that this was not disobedience. We were taught that this was right. We felt that we were right all the way, and we were making the rest of the world become right.
And Mrs. Luper had a thing that she liked to write plays and put on productions. She did that as a teacher at Dungy High School.
I decided to write a play that I called Brother President. And I'm not bragging, but it was a whale of a play.
With this play, we learned about the bus boycott, about the whole structure of segregation in Alabama as opposed to simply the segregation that existed in Oklahoma City.
I knew as a young child that we could not take a seat at a lunch counter. We could not go to a library because it was against the law in the state of Alabama. When we would go downtown to the theater, all of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony. And all of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor.
Defining Jim Crow laws is a Herculean task because there were literally thousands of Jim Crow laws across the entire country.
The term Jim Crow generally refers to laws that segregated blacks from whites.
One grand example of Jim Crow legislation, segregated schools. My entire education in elementary school, in junior high, and in high school was segregated. Jim Crow actually began as a kind of entertainment figure.
It refers to a character in a minstrel show, a white man who wore a black face.
This gentleman became very, very popular in the theater circuit across the country, and he became popular essentially by mimicking what he thought was black entertainment. And so at first, the idea of Jim Crow was this notion of whites playing blacks, at least in public performances. In the post-Civil War period, in the Reconstruction period, as those laws emerged that restricted rights of African Americans throughout the South, and in some places in the North as well, political scientists, historians, and others began to use a term that would encapsulate all of those pieces of legislation, and they called them Jim Crow laws. Every single state would have its own Jim Crow laws. One of the great untold secrets about Jim Crow is that most of the Jim Crow legislation emerged in northern cities before the Civil War. A piece of legislation that wouldn't allow blacks to ride on the streetcars came not in the South, but was established in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1850s. So Jim Crow is not a Southern phenomenon, it's a national phenomenon.
Herbert Wright, who was then the youth director for NAACP, came to town and saw the play and invited us to New York City to put on the play.
I told him we'd be happy to come, and he told me that he could only pay for the leading characters. There were 26 members in the cast. I went in to make my announcement, and those little kids put their eyes on me, and I couldn't tell them that they couldn't go. So I said, okay, y'all get packed, we all are going. So I came back to this community and asked the community to send them to New York City.
The group took a Greyhound bus north to New York City, 1,450 miles away.
Blacks were being served in the restaurant and sitting down and eating, and then hotels. Blacks were given rooms next door to whites. This was all an area of life that I had not seen.
Boy, when those kids got where they could walk in a restaurant and eat, they were just so happy and their eyes just blossomed.
I liked the new way of looking at life over the old way in which I lived.
We went to Arlington Cemetery, and that was quite an experience for all of us. Because as far as you could see crosses. And a little girl by the name of Barbara Pudsey stood there and she said, all of these people have died for freedom. I said, yes, all of these people have died for freedom. All of them.
The young cast members went back to Oklahoma City, energized by the new things they had seen.
They began to look over the things that had been done. The greatest case of all was that May 17, 1954, the Linda Brown case, and when those 9 white men dressed in long black robes said that segregation in education was wrong, any student would realize that if it was wrong in education, it's wrong in transportation, it's wrong in housing, it's wrong in public accommodation. So they decided that they wanted to take on the project of public accommodation based upon the experience they had had on this trip. So we were real excited about it. And the main thing was, how do we go about doing it? So we started a period of negotiation, and I had a friend, Mrs. Burke, who happened to be white, and we were selected as a delegate, as 2 delegates to go down to the restaurants and ask them to change their policies, and we did it. For 15 months, we would go down and they would explain to us why they couldn't do it. And they had a case, he said, if they would open their doors, they would lose their white clients. We went to the churches and they said, well, that's out of our category. We went to City Hall and they told us that's out of our business. A man has a right to run his business like he pleases.
Ayanna and I were in the NAACP Youth Council. The meetings were held in Ms. Luper's house. And we would, in the wintertime, we'd have the meetings inside the house. In the summertime, of course, nobody had air conditioning, so we would have the meetings in the front yard. We would just pull up chairs and have the meeting. And that's the conception for the sit-in started right there in her front yard.
The youth council advisor from the Wichita, Kansas Youth Council, who had moved to Oklahoma City as the director of the colored branch of the YMCA, came up for the meeting, and he was telling us about what had gone on in Wichita. And it was the same thing, that their youth council had gone into the restaurant, sat down, and decided they would just stay there until they were served. And so we were sitting there and we said, hey, why don't we do this?
And Marilyn Looper, yeah, she was about 10 then. And she said, well, no time is better than right now.
And my son Calvin and Marilyn got in a big debate over it. And finally, Barbara Posey said, well, our advisor is here, see what she says. And at that moment, my whole life reflected in front of me. I saw my dad, who had died in the Veterans Hospital, 1957, who had dreamed of someday his children would be able to enjoy these things. Someday. My dad had fought in World War I and had a scar that you talk to him 10 minutes and he would take you back to France, show you his scar. He was so proud. And I thought about him. And I said, do y'all really want to do it? He said, yeah. I said, okay.
No one said, let me call home and check with my parents and see if they'll let us go. Nope, we picked Katz Drug Store.
And they called my dad because he had a car. I think your mother or something.
My mother and Clara were best friends. And so we had a car too. It was just like, let's do it. And they were there and we were off to the races.
And that was the beginning of the beginning.
The initial question is, may I order a hamburger and a Coke? That was the script, as it were. And, they were shocked.
And the waitress came up and explained, well, we don't serve colored. And we would simply say, thank you, I'll wait. At that point, I still don't think anybody had asked their parents for permission. What we did was, when our parents went to work, they're gone, fine, get our clothes on, get up, get dressed. And then we went downtown.
I worked downtown Oklahoma City in the Hales building, which was just north of Katz Drug. And I went in Katz to have lunch, and everything was occupied. The sit-in had begun.
I was working downtown traffic when the sit-in started at Katz Drug Store. And we were assigned by Lieutenant I.G. Purser, who worked with us all the time, to maintain the peace. And we did not realize at that time the significance of what was going on.
I lived in a little town south of Oklahoma City at that time, and there were no black people there, and I had never experienced anything like that before, and you didn't realize there was a problem. That's just the way it was. I think the first day I walked in and saw all the stools occupied in cats, most of them, I think I was a little resentful.
I ate at a real small restaurant in the downstairs right there at Main and Robinson.
Were you aware that the blacks were not allowed to eat in those restaurants?
Actually, no. I mean, it's just something I didn't think about, looking back on it. Well, I realized when I went in there and ate, there was just white people in there, but I really did not realize that they was not allowed to eat in there. And I worked downtown.
They had never thought about us. You're white, you go downtown, you want to eat, you sit down and eat, and then you scoop. You never think about those people that don't have those privileges.
The insidious thing about all this is that we felt it was normal. We had grown up in this environment. It was something that we went through. We knew that other communities had similar laws or similar restrictions, and we just felt that it was as natural. Well, I was going to say we felt it was as natural as the rain, but there's something about it that didn't feel natural, and that's one of the reasons as to why people would eventually challenge it.
After school started, then that became our Saturday job. And job does not mean we were getting paid, because we were not, but it just meant that we reported to the movement and spent the day. And fortunately, stores closed at 5 o'clock then, so we could get off. And the next morning, we were back there.
George Tomick speaks with journalist Bob Matthews, Frosty Troy, and Ernie Schultz, who covered the events.
These kids were walking in a line with their eyes straight ahead, in their Sunday best, with their chins up. They said nothing, did nothing. I thought, these are little kids. What kind of courage they must have to go through this? And then I looked past them to the parents.
My parents were a little hesitant to let me participate in the sit-in movement. And it was after I kept begging, Mama, can I go? Daddy, can I go? They allowed me to do that, and partly because they had a lot of faith in Clara Luper.
I was a parent, and I thought, could I send my kids down to downtown Oklahoma City to sit in that environment for hour after hour after hour?
They were telling me that they wasn't afraid, and that they was really wishing more people would have let their kids go.
I don't know that I could have done that. I'd like to think that I could, but I really doubt it. Well, Mrs. Luper raised nonviolence to a new level. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's nonviolence and then there's nonviolence. Children, and well-behaved children, well-dressed children, attractive children, a woman with great poise and restraint.
Dignity.
How are you going to be violent in a situation like that without looking like an absolute fool?
The only sit-down restaurant with tables and waitresses and tablecloths in downtown Oklahoma City was in the John A. Brown department store. And we moved to John A. Brown's. And that's when the wall came up, and they were determined that they were not going to serve any African American, any black patrons.
My oldest daughter was always saying, well, how come they got two fountains, one colored and one white? Well, she would go to the white fountain and take her a drink. She was really a brave 10-year-old girl, because I didn't drink out of the white fountains. I said no.
I would come home and ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why segregation? Why racial discrimination? And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble. But Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me to get in the way and to get in trouble. It was good trouble.
Altogether, it was a moving feeling within me that I was sitting there demanding a God-given right. And my soul became satisfied that I was right in what I was doing. At the same time, with something deep down within me, moving me, that I could no longer be satisfied or go along with an evil system. That I had to be maladjusted to it. And in spite of all of this, I had to keep loving the people who denied me service, who stared at me.
I thought wrong. I was wrong, because I had used the newspapers, the radios, and I heard all of these white ministers and people talking about God and all of that. I thought that all at once they would come to my aid and say, Clara, you're right. But that didn't happen.
Just told them not to even come down. What you coming down here for? Go home. Go where you belong. And don't come down here anymore. And you're not wanted here.
And I was in a state of shock to see old white women and women who had gotten their rights through picketing, through walking, and who had just gotten the right to vote at the beginning of the 20th century. I couldn't believe these women couldn't understand. So as they cursed me, I was just looking at them. And I told our kids, we're going to practice nonviolence. Because this is what we have been taught. We're going to practice something that's as old as time itself and as fresh as today's newspaper. Love your enemies. Do good to those that do evil toward you. We're going to practice it. And we practice it. We practiced that as hard as we had the play, Brother President. We would stand over each other and we would call, "Oh, you old," and smile. If someone spit on you, wipe it off and smile. And then, you know what? We began to believe that and we felt good inside.
You've heard the concept boot camp? Probably the closest thing that comes to preparing for the sit-ins was boot camp. We were given different scenarios that it allowed us to go through a process of understanding what could possibly happen. Whether it was someone pushed you, what you would do. If someone spat on you, what you would do. If someone said something to you that was not kind, what you would do. If someone tried to move you, meaning the police came and literally tried to move you out of the space. I remember on several occasions we were sitting down on the ground, hide your body move so that you weren't hurt. The underlying concept of nonviolence was reiterated and broken down really to a child's level.
I didn't realize the threatening calls that I would get all times of night. I didn't realize that some days I'd wake up and shotgun shells would be on my porch.
So those times that we did it by way of our protest, and you were sitting there and they would look at you and not serve you, gave you a feeling of feeling inferior to everybody else.
At Brown's, I remember one case, and I didn't get to cover it. I'd given anything if I'd been there, but this 23-year-old man, this 15-year-old boy was sitting there, and he just reached down, just unprovoked, and just smacked him right in the jaw. What's amazing is the cops who were on hand constantly, they arrested both of them.
I think that goes back to I.G. Purser and his attitude. She schooled the kids in how to act, and he instructed the officers how they were to behave.
Immediately, if someone started to heckle them, we either told them to leave, which they did, or we put them in jail, which we did.
The sit-ins would take place on Saturdays. On that Saturday morning, we would meet at a church, and Clara Luper would, of course, tell us what we needed to do. But we would open our meetings with prayer. And being the song leader of the NAACP, we had our pep songs to get us ready for the day.
Music has always been such a huge part of the black experience in this country that it's no surprise at all that the people who were conducting the civil rights movement and putting themselves in harm's way would turn to music as a way of fortifying their courage, as a way of collectively deciding, yes, we not only can do this, but we must. Woke up this morning with my mind on freedom.
You want your freedom, and they'd have to say, yeah, you're going to walk. Yeah, we're going to talk. Yeah, we're going to sing. Yeah, we're going to pray. And we'd all get hyped up behind our freedom songs.
And there was one that just said, freedom, freedom.
I said F, I said F, I say F-R, I said F-R, F-R-E, F-R-E, F-R-E-E, F-R-E-E. F-R-E-E-D-O-M spells freedom, dot, 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 dot. And of course, as young people, we could really sing and put all the energy into that song. But it got us prepared.
They were critically important in creating an emotional environment in which it was really okay to go stick your head into the lion's den.
In 1960, in the spring of 60, if I remember correctly, when the sit-in started in Greensboro, by then we were seasoned demonstrators.
I remember the date. It was the 1st of February when 4 young fellows from A&T College in Greensboro sat down at the lunch counter at Woolworth's. And the manager said, you have to get up. I can't serve you. And they said, yes, you can. Go ahead. And a cup of coffee, please. And he wouldn't do it. There was some muttering and some really rude things were said, but nobody raised a fist and nobody got smacked. The second day, there were 20 kids there from the college. And the manager called the police. And the chief came, and the manager said, you got to run these guys out of here. And the chief said, I can't. They're not doing anything. They're just sitting there. The Greensboro Daily News was a responsible, good old gray newspaper, and it began to report not only on the activities and the fact that the crowds were getting bigger, but that it was peaceful. And they began to profile some of the people who were involved in the protest. And then other journalists, me included, got involved because, there's nothing that generates the interest of journalists like somebody else getting ahead of you on a story. So a lot of us went in there, and a lot of us saw dignity in motion, the self-assuredness, the utter concentration was so palpable when these kids came marching down the street out of their neighborhood of comfort and into a zone where they didn't know what was going to happen. I thought, these people are going to win because they're right.
People in Nashville, Tennessee had never seen or witnessed anything like that. They was shocked, in disbelief that these young black and white students will come and occupy lunch counter stools or go and take seats in a restaurant. And over a period of time, they would start jeering us. Some would spit on us, pour hot water on us or down our backs, put out lighted cigarettes in our hair or down our backs. They would start pulling us off the lunch counter stools and beating us. And the local police officials would come up and place all of us under arrest and never arrested the people that were creating the violence.
I was 20 years old when I first got involved. I was sitting in a cafeteria where students went between classes, and another student approached me and showed me a newspaper with the story in it about the Greensboro students and asked me what I thought of it. And I said I thought it was a great thing. And he said, don't you think it ought to happen here in Atlanta where we are? And I said, well, I know it's going to happen here in Atlanta. Somebody's going to do it. And he said, why don't we do it? And before I could say, what do you mean we? He said, you take this side of the cafe, I'll take the other side, and we'll organize a sit-in. About 200 of us went to various restaurants around Atlanta on that first Atlanta sit-in, and we all thought it was the greatest thing ever.
In April 1960, young sit-in students across the South received an invitation from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and activist Ella Baker to meet in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And this woman, Ella Baker, had done enormously bold things that very few people knew anything about. She made a speech called More Than a Hamburger. And she said to us that what you've done is a wonderful thing, but you should realize that this struggle for justice is about more than hamburgers. And you should be prepared to go forward and change the whole South, not just lunch counters.
At that meeting, he formed a new group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. John Lewis was elected president of the group. In the year 1960, a group of young whites joined the Oklahoma City sit-ins, inspired by a priest named Bob Brousseau. Father Brousseau started a group called the Young Christian Workers, developed by a Belgian priest named Father Joseph Cardian.
The whole point of this whole movement was to be practical, to be an activist, not a theorist. And so they developed a system called See, Judge, and Act, or Observe, Judge, and Act. That was observe the conditions make some judgment about what you could do to change them, and then to act, to go out and actually act, to do something about it in the streets and in society.
Bill Clifford was one of the first whites that sat down in protest with the children. He refused to be served at the luncheon counters until they were served. He was a member of the YCW.
I started attending Mass at St. Joseph's Old Cathedral. I looked in the bulletin and saw they had a meeting notice for young Christian workers, which were unmarried, single type. Girls are invited to the party type organization. So that seemed to be a good place to start meeting people.
It was very important to me and to the priests then, and to the Catholic laity then, to be activist in Oklahoma. It was a great time. It was an activist time. And I sort of put out a feeler, and it really burgeoned.
The idea that anybody couldn't be served in a public business was just totally out of character from my experience. So when again that situation met with the observe, judge, and act, I started to think about, well, what can I do? Because I felt I needed to do something. I had to act in some way. What can I do with this situation? When I got to Calvary Baptist Church for that first effort to sit in, I was the only white person present. I didn't expect to be the only white person present. I remember walking down from the church to downtown and thinking to myself, well, now's the time to leave if you're going to leave. But immediately the thought came to my mind, but they were so happy to see you.
Calvin Looper, he talked about what they were doing with the sit-ins. When he asked how many will join me Saturday, out of 200 people there, 100 hands went up in the air that they would be there Saturday. I probably wouldn't have got involved if only 7 hands went up, but that's what did show up.
Father Robert McDole was one of the 7 that showed up that day. He became fast friends with Clara Looper and inspired others to join in the protest.
At Calvary Baptist Church, while they were preparing us to go down, he said something about that, you may have to give your life for this. And people had given their lives for it, that people had been killed. And kind of a moment of dread just overwhelmed me, just a few moments. And I think Bill looked at me and said, "Are you okay?"
I took a day off to go, and all I remember is being afraid. It was a really scary experience. But they were so gracious.
Really and truly, we really were afraid to go downtown to protest anything. Anytime I could contribute financially, I did.
I did go down there one day, and they were in animals, and one of the people kicked one of the kids. I lost my temper, and Ms. Looper said I needed just help with the food and carry them down because she didn't want no violence.
We had a lot of people that were interested in violence, a lot of them. But then we had our things so set up, so if you are nonviolent and you have another job, you can go and answer the telephone. You can make calls, you can write letters. We had a place for everybody. We didn't exclude anyone. I remember one time we were down to Ralph's drugstore, and Porter was the one that spoke on nonviolence and explained everything. We got down there, when we walked up there, the man called me a bee, and Porter popped in front of all the kids. He had just been preaching about nonviolence. He was so embarrassed. It's hard, and he would tell you it's a long ways from believing in nonviolence and actually practicing it.
What YCW did for me, in a sense, the See, Judge, and Act is we got involved in the sit-ins at our parish and I think quite a few other parishes on really what was happening in the black community, and went week after week to John A. Brown's, our animals.
Anamods is a special place in all of our hearts.
Yes. We usually kept moving. As long as you kept moving, you had no fear of going to jail.
The whole thing about the Anamods was that the whole purpose was to sit down and stay, so the purpose was to get arrested.
Anamods is where we got arrested together, and there were a bunch of us that got arrested then.
Every time I went to jail, whites went with me.
I filmed Clara being dragged out with her heels dragging, but she, as they did, they went limp.
I would always warn them, if you're seen with us, you're going to be in trouble. And that was true.
In March, Father Robert McDole was carried out and arrested during a sit-in. He was soon transferred away to a small town on the Kansas border. The Oklahoma sit-ins made national news in the mainstream media for a second time.
What was the involvement of Mr. Charlton Heston?
2 years ago, I picketed some restaurants in Oklahoma, but without one exception, up until very recently, like most Americans, I expressed my support of civil rights largely by talking about it at cocktail parties, I'm afraid. But again, like many Americans this summer, I could no longer pay only lip service to a cause that was so urgently right and in a time that is so urgently now.
Black and white citizens during the summer of 1961 came from all across America to go on the Freedom Ride. It was a very dangerous mission for black people and white people to be seated together on a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus, or attempt to use the same waiting room, the same restaurant or lunch counter, or the same restroom facility. It was like putting your life, putting your body on the line. The Klan attacked the Greyhound bus between Atlanta and Birmingham, Alabama, near a little town called Anniston. They tried to burn the bus. An angry mob met us later in Montgomery, beat us, and left us bloody and unconscious at the Greyhound bus station. In spite of all of the violence, we could not let the threat of violence stop the Freedom Ride. We were prepared to die for what we believed in, and many of us accepted nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of living. So when we were being beaten, we tried to look our attacker in the eye, make some type of eye contact, and try to appeal to the best in that person and see the good in everybody, but never ever striking back.
In 1962, at the enrollment of James Meredith at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Ed Turner and I were sent to Mississippi by our station manager. There was one deputy marshal sent there from Oklahoma City, plus a contingent of federal reformatory guards from El Reno Reformatory. These men were deputized as U.S. Marshals. Their job particularly was to protect Meredith as he was brought to the university and enrolled. As we approached the campus, there were roadblocks and only certain people were being admitted. There was a construction project on the Ole Miss campus, and there were bricks with 3 holes in them. The students were taking those bricks and breaking them on a stone wall and throwing half bricks at knee and shin level toward the marshals and the reformatory guards who were guarding the building. When I was seeing them doing that and started filming them breaking those up and talking to the Mississippi Highway Patrolmen who were standing there watching them do this, I knew that the Highway Patrolmen were not going to protect me. So I knew at that time that it was best to ditch the camera and then go back and get it later. As the night went on and the crowd gathered and became more violent, if you turned on your light for your camera, you were subjected to rocks or stones. The most intense time was when I saw them bring in some of the marshals and the prison guards with broken legs and shins and knees, and they were using their billy clubs as splints. And this was inside the Lyceum building. That became a temporary first aid station. That night was a very trying time. Molotov cocktails, shotgun blast into the building, bricks and stones thrown toward the uniformed police officers and the marshals. A supply of tear gas was brought in. And when they brought out the tear gas, the crowd changed its mood.
The reporters did a terrific job. AP, UPI, the Daily Oklahoman reporters, the Oklahoma City Times, both Tulsa papers, excellent jobs.
On the other hand, in the South, where I observed in Mississippi and Alabama, the newspapers, dominantly white newspapers, no black reporters, no black staff, the white papers, I think they agitated. I think they kept it up. Of course, in Mississippi, in Oxford, they said it's squirrel hunting time in Mississippi. That's why there were over 600 or 700 rifles and shotguns confiscated on the campus that night, because everybody brought their rifle. And the word was gotten out beforehand, because Meredith had been trying to enroll for the whole year. He started in January, and it culminated in October the 1st. But the turmoil, I think, had been aggravated by particularly the newspapers.
Every Saturday before we attempted to go and do our sit-ins, we would sing, "We Shall Overcome." While we were walking from point A to point B, we would sing, "We Shall Overcome." So that particular song is a theme song for the civil rights movement. And to sing it gives you chills, because to me, it was powerful and it expressed the emotions of what we were about. And not that I'm a soloist, but you can feel, we shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Many of us got involved in this movement because we believed in a promise that America made to everybody who came here, whether you came as a slave or as a Mayflower person or as as any flower, whether you were Chinese from China or you were from wherever. There was a promise that these documents that founded this country made to all of us, that required us to make a commitment to America. not the government, but to America, the country.
The young people finally won the fight. On July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law.
One of the miracles of Oklahoma City was the fact that we had sit-ins from 1958 to 1964 without any violence.
Why then do you think when you moved to Arkansas, you moved to Mississippi, you moved to Alabama, things became violent?
The governor, Faubus wanted violence. He thrived on it. He thought it'd get him reelected, and probably did.
In Mississippi, Ross Barnett said, "I am a Mississippi segregationist. Have been, am now, will always be."
Governor Wallace.
Governor Wallace.
Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. The guy that befriended blacks indirectly the most was Raymond Gary, because he insisted that the federal law and the federal court orders be implicitly obeyed. He followed the rule of law.
And Raymond Gary at the time was
governor of Oklahoma. And by the way, it cost. I still believe, I'll go to my grave, I covered that Senate race. I think it cost him the election to the state Senate because he'd been a very popularly elected former state senator, and boy, he just did the right thing. And sometimes you pay the price.
I think it was a part of a process. When I went into the military, we had blacks and whites integrated for the first time.
In Korea, President Truman had integrated the armed forces. I'd never eaten with black people. I'd never slept with black people. This was just alien to me. And let me tell you how to get along on race relations. Know somebody. Yes. Know them as a person and not as a race. And in fact, when my brother was killed just a quarter mile from me on Heartbreak Ridge in Korea, it was a black guy, Joseph G. LaPlaca. We had half of a shelter. Remember the shelter hats?
Shelter hats.
Yeah, he's my half. And I spent just about an hour in his arms crying, and before the chaplain reached me on the field phone. That'll change your views on race really fast.
Once one's brain has been stretched by a new idea, it will never shrink back to its original dimensions. Right. And so going through the sit-ins, we understood that we had an idea, we went about it in a dignified way, we thought, and it worked.
But it was a great day when people were able to go and sit in restaurants all over Oklahoma City.
You were able to go into restaurants, but there were so many other issues that you needed to address: economic issues, housing issues, transportation issues, job issues.
With echoes of Ella Baker's speech, "More Than a Hamburger," the young people continued on.
I remember when we went downtown during the garbage strike and all of the National Guard and the police surrounded us. And I was sharing with Wayne what really stood out in my mind, and I still see it today and still remember it, is when they pulled guns on us and we were quite young. They took us inside to take us to jail. It wasn't rowdy or anything, but we had to go inside, and Miss Looper said, "Remain calm."
In many parts of the South, there were very few registered African American voters. Sometimes people were asked to pass a so-called literacy test. On one occasion, a man was asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. On another occasion, a man was asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. So we had to go.
Selma is a small town in Alabama, and it's not too far from the capital of Alabama, which is Montgomery, Alabama. And they have, in Selma, there was in the 60s a very active black community who wanted to do something about the fact that they were being denied their voting rights.
Selma was a place where only 2.1% of black people were registered to vote. And in Selma, you had a sheriff who guarded the courthouse like it was his own home. It was the only place you could attempt to register to vote. In the first part of January 1965, when it was my day to lead a group of people down to the courthouse, Sheriff Clark, Jim Clark, met us at the top of the steps. He said to me, John Lewis, you're an outside agitator. You're the lowest form of humanity. I looked Sheriff Clark straight in the eye, and I said, Sheriff, I may be an agitator, but I'm not an outsider. I grew up only 90 miles from here, and we are going to stay here until these people are allowed to register to vote. He said, you're under arrest. He arrested me, along with the 60 other people, took us all to jail. A few days later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others came to Selma. We started organizing the children, the young people. And hundreds and thousands of children would come down to the mass meeting at the church. Then they would participate in the march. And a few weeks after a series of demonstrations and marching, hundreds of people have been arrested, including Dr. King, school teachers, school children. There was a terrible shooting, outright murder of a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson while he was protesting. A confrontation occurred. He tried to protect his mother, and he was shot in the stomach by a state trooper. And a few days later, he died at a local hospital in Selma. And because of what happened to him, we made a decision to march from Selma to Montgomery, to dramatize to the nation and to the world that people of color wanted to register to vote. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, after church, about 600 of us lined up, walking in twos in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion.
In order for the march to occur, they had to cross over a bridge, and a lot, I forget the numbers, but there were a large number of people who were willing to participate in this march to Montgomery. Several. It was quite a journey, actually, and but they met with severe and violent intervention on the Pettus Bridge.
We get to the edge of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, crossing the Alabama River. Young man walking beside me by the name of Jose Williams saw all of this water down below. He said, John, can you swim? I said, no. Can you swim, Jose? And he said, yes, a little. I said, well, there's too much water down there. We're not going to jump. We're going forward. And we continued to walk. We came to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. And we continued to walk. And we came within hearing distance of the state troopers. And a man identified himself and said, I am Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march. Would not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church. And Jose Williams said to the Major, Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray. And the Major said, troopers advance. You saw all of these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us with nightsticks, whips, beating us, and then chasing us with horses and using tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. That Sunday became known as Bloody Sunday.
This drew national attention because it so happened that there were reporters on the scene for the initial march to Montgomery, and they actually interrupted live television programs here to show what was going on in Selma.
Dr. King came down the next morning to visit me in my hospital room and said, John, don't worry. We will make it from Selma. We'll make it to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act will be passed. And he informed me that he had made an appeal for religious leaders to come to Selma.
They wanted religious women to be a presence. The police would be less likely to attack a group of religious women standing in the front of lines. I was a Benedictine nun and I was teaching at McGinnis High School. And so my community knew that I had been interested in civil rights issues with the students. And so they asked me and another one of the sisters to go to Selma. And so we did. We caught a plane and flew to Selma.
John Lewis, just released from the hospital, joined the group to that final march to Montgomery.
I was in Montgomery to welcome the marchers when they arrived there, and to hear Dr. King speak on the steps of the state capitol. You had the feeling that things were tilting in your direction, that the movement was winning.
The world would never again be like it was.
We have to respect each other, and we have to do it based upon nothing else other than as another human being, we owe you respect.
If it's lost to history, that means you're going to have to replay that sometime or other. And I think it's terribly, terribly important that our young people learn what some people paid for social justice, and that social justice must continue to be won, and we need to re-win this battle of integration and justice again.
Many times I think we do try to forget, but I think we have to keep alive what has taken place and continue to build on it. If we don't continue to build on it, I'm afraid we may go back, and I don't want us to go back.
As young people, you can be involved. You cannot sit on the sideline. You got and must be in the arena. You must be out there pushing and pulling and doing your part. You must find a way to get in the way. You must find a way to make trouble, but let it be good trouble, necessary trouble. You cannot be satisfied with things that are not good and decent for all of our citizens and for all of the people that live on this little planet. You know, Gandhi said on one occasion, it is non-violence or non-existence. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put it another way when he said, we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish as fools. As young people, as leaders of the 21st century, you must get out there and be a headlight and not a tail light.